Right. Hello and welcome to the 2021 Berkley Lecture, The Global Rebalance of Power with Secretary Chuck Hagel. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. We're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join as a member on our website. In particular, I'm excited to share with you two special opportunities in the coming months. First, the IRC is pleased to partner once again with the University of Kansas in presenting a national security colloquium. Many of you will remember last year's colloquium, North Korea from the Inside Out, that looked at the world through North Korea's eyes before considering the perspectives of wider regional players and finally the United States view. This year's day-long program, Iran from the Inside Out, will pursue a similar track regarding the Islamic Republic. Please join us on Thursday, April 22nd. And we're also excited to introduce you to Global Horizons, a day-long sample of IRC programming on Thursday, April 29th. The International Relations Council has held space for global conversations that matter in Kansas City for more than 65 years. Staying home hasn't kept us from traversing the world or connecting around timely international themes and topics. If anything, opportunities have been broader, deeper, and more inclusive. We warmly invite you to join us on Thursday, April 29th for a day-long celebration, Global Horizons, where together we'll explore the full range of IRC programming and the diversity of the wider world. Events will run on Zoom throughout the day. Please do stop by as your time and schedule allow. And then join us that evening for the fan favorite World Quest Trivia Night. Thanks to the support of generous donors, this day of events is free and open to the public. So stop by, get to know the IRC, and join the conversation. Please do visit our website at irckc.org to learn more. The Berkley Lecturer was founded in 1996 and brings an expert in foreign policy and global affairs to the Kansas City area. The lecture was established through the Berkley Endowment to honor the IRC's founder, Elliot Berkley, for his decades of service, and to provide a platform for engaging community members in understanding critical global issues. This year's Berkley Lecture looks a little different, and it's worth reflecting on what the last year has meant to us, to you, to our world. Exactly 1 year ago today, we took the extraordinary step of closing the IRC office and moving all programs online. And there's so much we didn't know then. Since then, more than 2.5 million people worldwide have lost their lives. And so many others have been impacted in ways we couldn't have imagined. We miss you terribly. We miss our time together, and we can't wait to see you when it's prudent to do so. But with your help and incredible support, we've made it through together, and we found new and exciting ways to engage. I know how much we miss a buffet meal, but we're glad we can gather safely today while joining in this year's critical conversation on the global rebalance of power. The world order has been in flux since the end of the Cold War. In recent years, adjusted tariffs and trade, leadership transitions, peace and conflict, and shifting ambitions and alliances around the world have left their impact on the international community. This year's speaker, who you'll meet shortly and who will unpack the significance of where the world is and is headed, is no stranger to the IRC. In 2007, we were honored to present then Senator Chuck Hagel with the IRC's Distinguished Service Award for International Statesmanship. And we're delighted he's joining us again after these many years to share his further perspective on the world and the global rebalance of power. We hope you'll be active participants today. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We are especially grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program possible. in particular supporting sponsors Nicole Gresham Perry, Honeywell, Hush Blackwell, and the Lawrence D. Starr Center for Peace and Justice at the University of St. Mary. We also appreciate the contributions of Hallmark in making today's program possible. Thank you all for recognizing the timeliness and relevance of this conversation. It's now time for me to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. A longtime friend and colleague of the International Relations Council, Dr. Alan Holloman is Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Oxbridge Institutions and Policy Program at William Jewell College, our esteemed university organizational member in Liberty, Missouri. His areas of interest and expertise include comparative politics, looking at Russia and other post-communist states, European integration, and Iran. He received his PhD from the University of Kansas and is an alumnus of the University of Arkansas and the Ohio State University. Dr. Holloman, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. We are honored today to have Senator Chuck Hagel speak to us today and deliver the Berkley Lecture. Senator Hagel is a veteran of the Vietnam War. He is a recipient of 2 Purple Hearts. He is a successful businessman and a distinguished public servant. He was elected to the United States Senate from Nebraska, where he served from 1997 to 2009. In 2013, when Leon Panetta stepped down, President Obama nominated Senator Hagel to serve as Secretary of Defense. He led the Department of Defense until 2015. Secretary Hagel previously has served as professor at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has served as chairman of the Atlantic Council and co-chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. He brings a unique perspective on global affairs to Kansas City today, and he will speak to us about the global rebalance of power. Secretary Hagel, take it away.
Thank you. And for the introduction. And thanks to the Kansas City International Relations Council. Thank you for what you do for your community, for your states involved, for our country, and actually, maybe most important of all, what you do for the world, because you allow the world to come to Kansas City, and for Kansas City to go to the world, to understand our global community, because as you all know, we are not just citizens of a sovereign country, the United States of America, but we're citizens of a global community. And to facilitate an understanding of that and to address the big issues as to why it's important to understand global affairs and global dynamics and our place in this global community, I think is pretty fundamental to our future. And it has been for some time, but certainly it's going to be more fundamental to this country and our success in every way, our security in every way. When we look at the world today, let's just start with what we're dealing with in this country. The COVID pandemic. This is not a United States pandemic. This is a global pandemic. When you look at the environmental ups and downs and the volatility of our environment that we're seeing now, today, in this country, Western Nebraska, Colorado. But over the last few years, the volatility, the unpredictability of the environment, that's a world issue. That's a global issue, the environment. So wherever you fit, in your community, in your businesses, in your schools, and all vocations, wherever you all fit, they fit in your community, in your country. They also fit in the world somewhere. And there's not anything in our society, in our culture, unaffected by what happens in the world. You've all asked me today to talk about a changing global landscape. And global power shifts and what that means and how it affects us. What is our role? And I'm very pleased to address that because there are so many pieces to it. We won't have time for everything. But what I'll try to do is maybe give you at least my perspective on how this occurred. And I'm going to limit my frame of reference to the last essentially 75 years and where I think we are today and then where I think we're going tomorrow. The specific questions I'll leave to you because I know you'll all have questions and we'll have time for that. But when we look at global affairs, America's role in it, our leadership, where do we fit? The balance of power in the world. You start with World War II, I think. That's the modern era of world affairs, starting there, because after World War II, we did something, our leadership, because we were the only economy standing in the world, our leadership, along with allies and adversaries, put together a world order referenced in many ways, accurately, a so-called liberal world order. And what that was about is that they formed, the leaders at the time, formed an order in the world that had been missing that addressed the common interests of all countries. Not that this world order was going to solve all the problems, it couldn't, or address all the differences, it couldn't, but at least would establish some order in the world so that we wouldn't, like what had happened in the first 50 years in the 20th century, send armies across each other's borders. And of course, the advent of the nuclear weapon changed everything. So the wise leaders that emerged after World War II, many had led us through World War II. Certainly Eisenhower, Churchill were George Marshall, two of the preeminent leaders, brought into force this coalition of common interest: the United Nations, collective security, NATO, IMF, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, dozens of multilateral banks and institutions that were developed and focused on development in areas of the world that had never had any development. And the whole point was, the point of common interest was the world would be more secure, more stable, more predictable, more prosperous if we could help educate more people, find more economic prosperity, develop more economic prosperity in all countries, develop exchange programs so countries and people could understand each other, not vilify each other or hate each other, but understand each other because we all had common interests. And those common interests are certainly reflected today. I mentioned two of them. Pandemic health. This probably is not going to be the last pandemic health issue the world faces. Environment. Environment, we know, is important, not just because of the sun and the snow and hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever, but because it affects development. It affects food production. It affects billions of people of how they live. It affects poverty. It affects disease. It affects hunger. And those elements bring conflict. We know that through history. We know that today in the world. And the more poverty, the more volatility, the more uncertainty, the more conflict. So we are now today, this global community of a little over 7 billion people. Demographers tell us that we're going to probably put 2 billion more people on the face of the earth in the next 35 years. We're not doing a real good job now with 7 billion. So what's going to happen when we put 2 billion more people on the face of the earth? We haven't solved the environmental issues yet. Lot of big problems still out there that rage across the world, evidenced by the conflicts that we have in some parts of the world. So that's where you start. At least that's where I start, in understanding global power shifts and global power balance, America's leadership. As you all know, it was America that led this effort. And it is American leadership that has essentially kept this, over the last 75 years, together. Imperfect, like I said, couldn't solve all the problems. But at least a couple of things have occurred. And I'd say pretty big things when you think about it. And we take both of these for granted in many ways, I think, especially younger people. No World War III. That's pretty significant. And no nuclear exchange. And that's significant. Now, it doesn't mean that that can't happen. And also, I think, in the plus column, what has happened, not what hasn't happened, but what has happened. More people free today, with more opportunities than ever in the history of mankind. More prosperity, more education, more democracy, more hope. Just hope, what all people need, because without hope, a lot of bad things happen because people have no choice. And hope is critical, absolutely critical, as you all know. Education programs, better understanding of each other, travel. We have made progress on the environment. We have made progress in business exchanges, and trading with each other, and getting along with each other. All of that is in the plus column. That's resulted, I think, directly. It's come from the world order that America helped lead 75 years ago. I know there are those who are questioning that world order today. Why is it significant? I don't think it's that significant. This would have happened anyway. I don't think so. But I ask them, well, think for a moment, if we'd not had any of these institutions, as imperfect as they are, the United Nations, collective security with NATO, go through all of them and take them away. Do you think the world would be better off than it is today? Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. We would have had some kind of a nuclear exchange, probably some kind of a World War III. So, at least in my opinion, the world order that we built and continue to maintain is absolutely critical to the future, because of the complications that we're going to face into the future, far more complicated than we have today. Today is far more complicated than it was 20 years ago, than it was 30 years ago. So as I move from that little historical perspective, which you all know and understand, we go to, well, what's happened today? Where are we? There's no question that there has been significant erosion in the confidence and trust of a world order by all nations. I mean, the UK pulling out of the European Union is an example. Authoritarianism starting to rise in different Western democracies in Europe. Certainly Hungary and Poland are good examples. What's been happening over the years in Turkey. You've got volatility in every one of those Western democracies, not just the United States, by the way. I mean, you go to Germany, the ultra-right, the neo-Nazi groups. Every Western democracy is challenged today. Then you expand and extend that beyond where are we in Asia, in Africa, and other parts of the world. We're actually seeing some of the progress that we've made over the last 75 years we've seen that evaporate. We've seen that pull back because, using one example, business example, and you business people who do business internationally understand this, an arbitrary unilateral use of tariffs and use of sanctions, bypassing the World Trade Organization, which, as you know, was the general agreement on tariffs and trade that came out of this world order building after World War II. No longer are we paying attention to international norms or international forums. And I've always been struck with the WTO because I hear from different people that, well, the United States shouldn't use it because it's not fair or whatever the reason. Well, the reality is the United States has won far more cases in the WTO than it's lost. That's just an aside. But you see the diminishing world order effects and reaches that we witnessed over the years, and especially I think for a couple of reasons. I think there's more than a couple, but I think the implosion of the Soviet Union in the early 90s and essentially the restructuring and rebuilding of a large part of the globe, certainly starting with Russia, how that affected Europe, how that affected obviously Russia, how that affected China, how that affected our relationship. And so through the 90s, as Russia was on its knees, had no legitimate government, the armed forces, there were none. The risk of the Soviets, now the Russians, selling off nuclear weapons was very real, hence the Nunn-Lugar Act of the early 90s. Their economy, they had no economy. That affected, obviously, the rise of China in some ways. I mean, China was rising in its own way, in its own time, but taking Russia out of the equation, the Soviet Union, certainly opened up a lot of opportunities for Russia. It opened up opportunities for us. It opened up opportunities in Europe. And I think that was one of the first defining dynamics to start seeing a world order shift. Then came about 10 years later, 2001, and what happened on 9/11 in this country. That was the second very defining event that I think shook the world order. Because for one thing, it put in question how effective is the world order, for example, in intelligence sharing, intelligence gathering with other nations, with other people, our own intelligence. How could this happen? This happened in the United States of America without somebody knowing about it. Did our institutions fail us? These were not internal terrorists to the United States. These were people who came in from other parts of the world that did this to us. So if our world order is so effective and so good, it failed us here. I mean, how could we not know about this? Well, that's but one example. All the consequences that followed those two events. We invaded Afghanistan that year, 2001. Early 2003, we invade Iraq. We didn't just invade them, we occupied them. We're still in Afghanistan. We're still in Iraq. That unleashed tremendous turmoil and an explosion in the Middle East, which we're living with now. The Middle East is more dangerous today than it's ever been. You've got non-functioning government, non-state actors now, countries. I mean, Lebanon has no functioning government. Yemen, Syria, Libya, Iraq still in trouble. But those actions unleashed those forces that extended into North Africa, and we're still seeing all of that going on in North Africa. So not to get so completely consumed with that event, but that being another event that occurred, a defining event that started really changing things, changing the balance of power. So now Russia, after we kind of dismissed them through the 90s, and under Putin's leadership, now they're becoming, as we really weren't paying much attention, more and more significant. They're not a great global power. The Soviet Union was an economic midget, but they had the largest field of nuclear weapons, resources, oil and gas, more than any country in the world. So they could play, and they had a very large military that was around the world. All of that started to get built back under Putin, and is still being built back. At the same time, China was ascending. That started to shift a balance of power, especially in Asia, which culminated in a lot of things. But during the Obama administration, it certainly culminated in his decision to the so-called shift to the Pacific, shift to Asia. And as I was Secretary of Defense, and I would go to Asia, and I took more trips to Asia and the Pacific, long trips, than actually Secretary of State Kerry did. I was constantly asked by my NATO counterparts, what does that mean? Are you abandoning the rest of the world? Well, I don't think we ever made a clear statement on that shift. Exactly why were we so-called shifting to Asia? Well, we were shifting to Asia for our interests, and in every way, our commercial interest, economic, trade, security interest, partnership interest, allied interest, because that's where the people were. That's where the allies were. And the markets, not the allies, but the markets. That's where the alliances were starting to gather and strengthen. But it didn't mean, and this is what we didn't articulate very well, it didn't mean that we were abandoning any other part of the world. We weren't abandoning NATO. We weren't abandoning our relationships elsewhere. We were still going to be present and still going to be part of all that in the leadership. And I don't think the message got through in many ways. So if you follow that along the line here to what happened in the first 10 years of the 21st century, the upheaval that was occurring, China's ascendancy, Russia's ascendancy, the questioning of the world order, and the effectiveness of the world order. The UK had been effectively challenging that for a number of years before they made the decision to pull out of the EU. Well, they're building up this parliament that they're taking our independence away, and we can't move without EU's approval. And I think a lot of those complaints were real, and I think legitimate. But what mistake was made, I think, and I don't blame just the UK on this, I blame all of us, that rather than understand that institutions, and certainly the ones that I'm talking about, these global institutions, world order institutions, are shifting all the time because the world shifts. New opportunities arise, new challenges arise, new dangers arise, power shifts. And so your institution and your organization, like any organization, whether it's International Relations Council or a university or certainly a company, Hallmark or any company, you have to adapt. You're constantly adapting and adjusting and moving and shifting and anticipating markets and what's coming next. Doesn't mean you give up who you are or your product, the essence of the product. But it all comes down to two things. I've always felt, and the more I get around the world, the more I see, and the older I get, the more convinced I am of this. And it's involved, and it is the essence of everything, of personal relationships, of business relationships, political relationships, everything. And that is trust and confidence. If you don't have trust in someone or an organization or a government, you got a problem. And it's only going to get worse unless you address it. And the other one is confidence. Unless you've got confidence in the leadership and the rest that goes with confidence, it's not going to end well. And I think essentially the world has lost confidence and trust in the United States over the years. And I don't blame any one person or any one political party or one thing. I think it's a cumulative effect that's been occurring. But what really highlighted it, and I'm going to be careful here because I'm not going to get into politics, but the last 4 years of foreign policy in this country, if there's been a foreign policy, has been one thing: America first. And when you have a president of the United States that goes before the General Assembly at the United Nations every year, every September, and gives a speech, and that speech is all about America first, all the rest of you guys have been freeloaders. You've been living off of us. And when you sanction and you tariff allies and you go around institutions, international institutions, you go around them and bypass them, you just go directly. I say we tariff you, France, on your wine or whatever it is. That doesn't help things. How you handle China as China was exploding with growth and with success and being aggressive. If we've not handled them correctly, and I don't think we have, you're going to have a shaken alliance and allies in Asia and the Pacific, as I was often told by leaders in Asia, in the Pacific. Well, you can say what you want, Mr. Secretary, but you don't live here. You live 5,000 miles the other way. Yeah, you've got a Navy in the South China Sea and East China Sea. You've got bases that Japan lets you use, South Korea lets you use, Guam, and so on. But it's not the same thing. We live here. This is our home. Asia is our home. We have to deal with China. I don't think we ever assimilated that well. And we had problems with South Korea and Japan because we constantly said, well, you're not doing enough. You're not paying enough, as we did to our NATO allies. Well, in the cases of NATO allies, for example, many of those countries were not making, most of the NATO countries were not making the 3% gross domestic product commitment that they all made when they joined NATO. But there are other offsetting advantages that they would bring. For example, allowing us to have a base in their country. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. So not to get too deep into this, I think, and there are so many other reasons, I think our allies in the world has lost confidence and trust in us. And the other one is, and maybe in many ways more important than any of the other ones I mentioned, is our internal affairs in this country. This country has never seen the political polarization that we see today, except probably for the Civil War. I remember in 1968, my brother and I were in Vietnam in 1968. That was the worst year for Americans. We sent back 16,000 dead kids, 16,000 dead Americans. Now, America would never stand for that today. Leading your kids to slaughter, 16,000 of them in 1 year, and having no exit strategy or how are you going to win this? That wouldn't happen today. But what's happened over the years is that we lost sight of so much and where we were going, and the polarization, and both parties have to take responsibility for this. The divide in this country that occurred in '68, mainly because of Vietnam, was a pretty bad year. Kennedy assassination King assassination, riots, cities burning, bad year. Chicago Democratic Convention. But I think the depth and width of the polarization and the political problems we've got in this country today, over the last few years, are far deeper. It went far more in extended areas than '68. So I would go back to the Civil War as a line. Now I wasn't around for the Civil War, but I read occasionally. I think you got to go back that far to find a time that this country's been so divided. I mean, just look at the election this year. And certainly a certain percentage of Americans still, a significant percentage of Americans still believe that this election was fraudulent, that it was stolen, as the former president of the United States continues to maintain. Well, the world watches us. The world looks in, as we like to hold ourselves up to this shining city on the hill, this greatest democracy ever. And the world sees this, and they shake their head, and they look at abdication that we continue to make in our global leadership responsibilities, working with allies and so on. Then they see how divided we are, that we can't even pass a budget. The Congress of the United States can't pass a budget. When I first got to the Senate, doesn't mean I was a good senator or anything was special, but we passed budgets every year. That's what you did. Democrats, Republicans got along, they made their points, they argued, but for the good of the country, you got a budget. We passed appropriation bills. We made government work. Government doesn't work anymore because it's just so polarized. Social media has done part of this. Campaign financing, which is a joke and is terrible. A lot of things have attributed to it. But my whole point in this is that our internal problems, and they're significant, I think have led to a downward spiral in the confidence and trust that allies, our friends, our partners have in us, and our adversaries take advantage of that. I mean, for example, today the papers are full of stories about China all over Brazil, helping Brazil out with vaccinations, and China sending vaccines into Brazil, as they are in other Latin American countries. China's been playing in Latin America for a long time. Russia's doing some of the same thing. Well, when you're Brazil in these countries, not just Asia, and Brazil's not a Pacific country, but certainly that matters, that counts. People see that. So I'll end my remarks this way. Where do I think this is going? Do we have any hope? Can we get out of this? Yes, global power shifts are occurring, but that's not new. It's happened throughout history. Institutions have to change. They have to, as I said, and you know it, adapt and adjust and reflect the current world that we're in. That means new opportunities, new challenges, new problems, and then what's yet out there. Well, in an uncertain world, that's pretty hard to do. It was much easier to do 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, 30 years ago, but pretty hard now with technology and everything is revolutionizing our cultures and our societies. But I think we've got to get back to some basics, and that is rebuilding, restructuring our alliances, reaching out to our allies, and I think President Biden made this very clear in his campaigning, and he's certainly done it since he's started. We've got to reestablish trust with our allies, their confidence in us, their confidence and trust in us. That affects how we deal with China as well as Russia or North Korea, Iran, because they see that. And we're much more effective when we can talk to China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, from the perspective of not just the United States talking to, but this is a block of nations around the world talking together about this. And how do we make something work here? That's the first thing. That is priority number one. At the same time, we've got to fix this country, the internal issues that we've got to fix in this country. And I don't mean just the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic, obviously the economic consequences, which affect everybody and everything, every institution, but also our politics. I mean, we've got to find leaders at both parties who will respect each other, not call each other enemies, not bring an absolutism to politics like religion. I'm absolutely right all the time. You're absolutely wrong all the time. So we don't need to hear from you. Well, there's only one alternative to that. There's a democracy, representative government, where you have a lot of points of view, but then you compromise and you come together and make something work for the good of the country. The alternative is just authoritarianism, and the dictator can make the choices, like we're seeing, unfortunately, in Turkey, emerging in Hungary, emerging in Poland, and there are other countries. I think there's a lot at risk here. And I think it is not just the global aspect of it, because I don't think you can now separate the global interests, global actions, global policies from domestic. Yes, they've got their own channels, of course, but it is all now one. And if you don't do all of it together, then you're not going to fix this. I think we can fix it. I think we will fix it. I think a lot of it will become the real focus, and it's always been this way in the history of America, of our next generation of leaders. I think they're the ones who are seeing it and who will fix it. And I get that from talking with the younger members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. So I've covered a lot of general ground here, and I've left open, I know, a lot of areas where we can talk about anything you want in the questions, I thought. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have lots of questions coming in from the audience. I want to start off with one, and then I will turn to those. We often grow up, different generations, hearing the term the United States is a superpower. Secretary Albright said that the United States is the indispensable nation. I want to ask you a question as someone who's been a policy practitioner and an elected official. How do you define the term superpower? And does that term still apply to the United States today in the modern world? Does it matter? Does that kind of thinking hurt us or help us?
Well, take the last part of your question first. I think it hurts us. I think that definition hurts us because it implies that we're above everyone else, that we're super, and the rest of you are just mere mortals, and that we're in a class of our own. And I think the vibrations that come from that are not good. I don't think they're powerful. Everybody in the world knows the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. Why? What defines it? Economic power is really more critical than military power, because without economic power, you eventually are not going to have military power. I mean, we saw that happen in the Soviet Union. But the most important power and perception of power comes from the internal power, your government, your country, your people. What are they able to agree on? What can they do? What can they accomplish? And that reference I think I made in my points here a little earlier. And when you've got that internal problem, you're not going to be seen the same way. So I think what defines superpower to me is a country that has all the elements that I think are required in a great power. Governance, its people, internal, economic, security, military. I think all that together defines, I would say, not superpower, but a great power. And we're seeing only one other power emerge like that, and that's obviously China. But I've always felt that China has such internal problems and conflicts that they're going to be facing, as they are now, but they're going to be facing some very significant problems in the out years as the conflicts on the lines on the graph start to meet. You can't have a trade economy, a so-called free trade economy, or a China free trade economy. That's not compatible with authoritarian government, with a dictatorship. That didn't work. That will not work. They're getting away with it now for, I think, a lot of reasons. They're smart, they're big, they're industrious. How they've used their power has been very smart, and other reasons, but I don't think it can be sustained for the reason I've just mentioned.
We have a question here from the audience, if we may go to some of those. How should the United States, speaking of changes and balances of power, how should the United States respond to Saudi Arabia over the role of Prince Mohammed bin Sultan in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi? And is our current response adequate? Does Saudi Arabia need the US more than the US needs Saudi Arabia?
Yes, Saudi Arabia needs us more than we need them for a lot of reasons. Certainly, the advent of alternative fuels that has really weakened and will continue to weaken Saudi Arabia's position, not just in the Middle East, in the world. But the bigger question, I do not think that our response to Saudi Arabia was adequate. You can't say, for example, that our foreign policy is very much based on values, principles, support for human rights, and we'll take those conditions and apply our approach to adversaries and how they do it. But allies, strategic allies, will take a little different approach. So when pretty clear to me, and I believe our intelligence agencies on this, as well as other intelligence agencies, that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia knew exactly what was going to happen, ordered what was going to happen to Khashoggi, but yet our response to him, because he represents our tepid response represents a country that has been a strategic ally, is different from how we respond to the Chinese or how we respond to Iran or to Russia. Therein again lies the consistency of our country and our policies, resulting in lack of confidence and trust. Well, the United States treats one country this way, but yet another country. The fact is, and I don't know if it was Secretary Blinken who said it, and I know Tony Blinken very, very well. I've known him for 20 years, been all over the world with him when he worked for Biden, as Biden and I have been all over the world together. And I have the utmost respect for him. I think he's going to be a great Secretary of State. But I thought his response was really kind of weak. And when he said, well, we've got to look beyond the individual actions of an individual leader, that's the country. Well, the way I would say that, I would just reverse that. You can replace a leader. We're not holding Saudi Arabia responsible for what happened to Khashoggi. We're holding the Crown Prince responsible. But you're saying something else, Mr. Secretary. And so I think we've got that backwards. So that's my opinion of the Saudi Arabia thing. I think their position continues to weaken over the years for a lot of reasons. And it's not, history is not unfamiliar with monarchies. And I don't think the future of the world is monarchies. I remember George W. Bush saying one day, and he said it publicly, after we invaded Iraq, Iraq will be the beginning of a model democracy in the Middle East, and it will bring other democracies. The Middle East will flourish with new democracies. And I said to him one day, I said, Mr. President, how do our allies, most of them are monarchies in the Middle East, how do they feel about what you just said? That they're going to be eliminated. And he just kind of laughed. But no, the future is not monarchies.
Okay. Another question for you as long as we're in the neighborhood of Saudi Arabia, looking across the Gulf, it involves Iran. In your view, as a former Secretary of Defense, how should the Biden administration approach Iran in dealing with its nuclear development program? And what sort of deal do you think is feasible in view of Iran's upcoming presidential election and the fact that it also has domestic politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start with the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which I was involved in and very involved in leading up to it through our involvement in the Defense Department. I strongly supported that. I strongly support it today. I think it was a huge mistake to drop out of it for a lot of reasons, by the way. That was a very good deal for us. Very good deal for us. For the first time, it put our inspectors into Iran, into their nuclear plants. They got rid of all the centrifuges. It put them in a position that it would take them 10 years to be able to start getting back to where they were. One of the criticisms I heard as well, but I think it was 13 years, but what about after 13 years? And I said, well, listen, that's a good question, but you explain to me, what is the world going to look like in 13 years? Can anybody tell me? I've never met anybody that smart that can tell me what the world's going to look like in 13 years, the United States or anything. I'll take this because what this does, this builds a base of confidence and trust. I mean, Iran and the United States would be a long time before we're buddies. That's not the point of the deal. But you build a base so that you can address the next set of issues. Their ballistic missiles, their terrorism, their support of terrorism. And that's the smart way to do it. You take the most immediate threat and you deal with that. And yes, they got something out of the deal, but that's the way deals are. Everybody's got to get something out of the deal. And I always reminded people, look who signed this deal. It was our three strongest European partners, France, Germany, and the UK, China, Russia, the United States, European Union, United Nations, and Iran. I mean, give me another deal that all of those people can agree to that's serious. So the way I think Biden's got to come at it, I think he's doing exactly the right thing, is opening the door. We want to sit down. As you know, the Europeans have invited the United States and the Iranians to sit down and start, no preconditions, to start talking. But both sides have said, no, you got to stop this, or no, stop this. Well, eventually we'll get there. That's where it starts. That's the process of diplomacy. And a lot of the people on the phone here on the Zoom conference know about diplomacy, practiced it. But that's the way you start. Not from the first invitation to the first day. That's the way you get to the table. That's the way you start to work it out. I remember the whole process that we went through. I mean, we went through about 2 years before we could really get to where we wanted to go on this thing. But that's the way it works. And I think that's a smart way to do it. You got to be smart. You have to be tough. You got to be direct. You have to be clear. You have to be honest. Iran, just like China, they watch us. They respect power. They respect directness and clarity and firmness. And if you equivocate, you can't do that either. So I think Biden's approach to this is exactly the right approach. It may be a half a year or a year before they sit down, but I don't think you can walk away from it. It's just too dangerous.
Okay. Secretary Hagel, another question from the audience. With the rise of China and the reemergence of Russia and the relative decline of U.S. primacy in the world and increased internal conflict in the United States, do you believe that we will continue our trend of no World War III and no nuclear exchange, even a limited one, over the next 20 years?
I hope so. I don't know, but the signs are very bad. I mean, the United States has withdrawn from all of our nuclear deals that we've had with the Soviet Union and Russia. I co-chaired a task force over the last year. My two task force co-chairmen were the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, and the former Foreign Minister and Defense Minister of the UK, Malcolm Rifkin. And it was all about where do we go? Really, the question, where do we go from here with non-proliferation in the world? It was sponsored by someone you guys work with, I'm sure, the Ivo Dalder, who is president of the Chicago World Affairs Council, your sister council. Ivo was ambassador to NATO for 4 years under Obama. I've worked with Ivo for a number of years on different jobs he's had in government. It was underwritten by the MacArthur Foundation. We had a task force of 15 top people from around the world, from Asia, Europe, Africa, everywhere, on the future of nonproliferation. And what we're now doing is we're briefing out that paper to the Pentagon, State Department, governments in Australia, Japan, South Korea, and so on, because I think we have allowed the nuclear issue just to drift probably for 25 years, because 20 years ago, what consumed us was terrorism, what happened on 9/11. And that's been our entire focus, whether it's security, intelligence, or whatever. We just kind of let nuclear issue drift. Well, the North Koreans haven't, the Iranians haven't, and you go back to confidence and trust. And a lot of countries are thinking about maybe they should start their own nuclear program, because can you count on the United States and its nuclear umbrella to protect them? And that's the reason. I mean, we have 9 nuclear powers today, and that seems like a hell of a lot, and it is. But if we'd not had that nuclear umbrella guarantee the United States has had, we'd have a hell of a lot more nuclear powers today. Japan would be one, certainly Saudi Arabia would be one. There'd be other countries as well looking at it. We don't want that, so we've got to pay attention to this. And I think we've got to get back to some kind of non-nuclear proliferation treaty format or something. And I think the Biden administration agrees with that, at least from what I've been told in dealing with them, and we'll see. But again, we've got a lot of problems in the world: economic problems, health problems, environment problems. And I know people say we can only deal with so much at one time. And if we're having a problem walking and chewing at the same time, sure as hell, the rest of the world is too.
I'm sure. Secretary Hagel, we've come to the end of our official time, but we have lots of questions coming in from our audience who are fascinated by your presentation. Would you be able to hang around for about 15
Sure.
minutes?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Then I'll ask a couple of others. We have a question here regarding food and agriculture. And one of our audience asks you, since politicians are so polarized and unable to find consensus in foreign policy, what can business leaders do to build alliances and instill trust in the United States as a dependable supplier of food and agricultural products?
Well, I think it's happening now. And those who are on the Zoom call know what I'm talking about and participating. I think American companies are doing that now in trying to work their own venues, work their own channels with suppliers and others that they deal with around the world. Not excluding the government, because the government has the power to sanction and tariff and so on and so on. But I think the private sector involvement here, I think, is going to become more and more important. And I think become more and more recognized in our government, how important that is, the private sector, because it's the private sector that connects it all. The government regulates it. The government sets policy, but it's the business to business that connect, that make it happen. And so I don't think you can overstate the importance of business here, and overstate their importance in diplomacy and relationships. And I hope that this administration will take that approach to its policy. I hope the Congress, for the good of whether you're Democrat or Republican representative, but the good of your constituents. I mean, we have Democrat farmers, we have Republican farmers. Democrat Republicans are in every business. So, I mean, let's stop dividing up by party. No, I'm a Trump person, or no, I'm a Biden person. No, I'm a Republican, Democrat. No. Let's do the smart thing for the country to get our economy going. And that's the approach that we should take. And take the essence of politics out of it. And I think that will happen. I do it. I said earlier, the reason I think that's going to happen, because it must happen. It must happen for our own benefit. But the young leaders see this, and they're going to make it happen.
We have another question from the audience going to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The question reads, the Abraham Accords are a sign for peace in the region, but how important still is the two-state solution to the sustainment of peace, or if other nations simply place their own interest above the Israel-Palestine issue?
Yeah, well, I think the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a very important factor in being able to see or envision at any point relative peace in the Middle East. You just saw an example of this in last week, when Jordan refused to allow Netanyahu to fly over Jordan to go to Dubai. The first time Netanyahu would have been in Dubai and the UAE. And Jordan said no. Well, Jordan has a treaty, as you all know, with Israel. But because of a Palestinian issue, because Al Mosque there in Jerusalem, the holy place of Islamists in Jerusalem, there was a conflict because the crown prince of Jordan wanted to go. And evidently both Jordanian and Israeli security couldn't work out the arrangements. So Jordan said, to hell with you. Netanyahu's not going to be using our airspace. Shocked everybody. Well, that's one little sign. It's a Palestinian issue. It's still at the bottom of this. Now, the Gulf countries are a bit immune from that. I get that. They support the Palestinians in different ways, but their interests are different. They don't have the same interest. It's not that they turn their back on the Palestinians, but they've got a different set of dynamics at that end of the Middle East. But that said, the United States position is still a two-state solution. You've got a big and important election coming up with the Palestinians, and the United States has laid some requirements out that Hamas can't participate. We're not going to sanction or agree to or in any way support elections when you've got a branch of the Palestinians, any way you want to say it, who continue not to deny violence and won't recognize Israel. So we've got a big problem. But I still think it's at the essence of much of the problem in the Middle East.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question. Admiral Philip Davidson, the commander of the United States Indo-Pacific Command, told the Senate Armed Services Committee recently that the People's Republic of China could launch an invasion of Taiwan within the next 6 years, bringing forward its plans for unification as early as 2027. If you were still Secretary of Defense, what advice would you give the president now to prevent this?
Well, I think our options are limited. I go back to what I said earlier. We don't live there. I mean, what China has done in building up their armed forces, especially along that vast Pacific border they have, and Taiwan is just a few miles across that border. I mean, the anti-aircraft missiles, the hardware, sophistication of drones, radar, their sophisticated planes, ships. It's an immense armament concentrated in that area. There's no way we could bring in enough carriers or anything to stop it. So we patrol that area, and we have presence in that area, and we're going to continue to have presence. And that would be the first thing I would tell the president. Mr. President, we need to keep our presence there, a strong military presence in Japan, South Korea, that entire East China coastal area, and let the Chinese know that we support the Taiwanese. At the same time, again, try to diffuse all the other elements of a China-U.S. relationship on intelligence matters. Obviously, cyber is a huge problem, and it's going to continue to be a huge problem. I think it's the biggest one threat to our country is cyber attacks. I mean, cyber is just insidious, quiet. You don't know when it's coming. You don't know where it's coming from. And all of a sudden it hits. It can take out a power grid, entire Midwest, entire East Coast, ruin your financial system. I mean, they could lock down our computers on our ships and so on in defense. So we need to work with China on some other things too, so that we don't get to a point that, oh my God, the option is, how are we going to prevent them because we have intelligence that they may try to take Taiwan in a month. We don't want it to get to that point. So I think you use diplomatic power, engagement, commercial, all interests that we have, that China has. I think you got to use all of that, and your military and your intelligence, to prevent it from ever getting to the point that, and it may anyway. I mean, who knows? You can't predict it, but you want to do everything that you can to control it now, to push it back.
Okay, Secretary Hagel, would you mind speaking a bit to the situation in Yemen? What steps could we take to get the Saudis to allow food sitting on ships at sea to be brought to Yemeni children? And where do we stand with our relationship with our Kurdish allies in northern Iraq?
Well, we are strong supporters of our Kurdish allies in Iraq. Joe Biden and I drove from Turkey into Iraq in 2002, December of 2002, just a couple of months before we invaded Iraq. And Biden and I spoke to the Kurdish parliament in Erbil. And it was fascinating. We spent 3 days in northern Iraq. Fascinating experience. And what the Kurds had done in 10 years, because people forget, and this is why we should have never invaded Iraq. It was foolish. It made no sense, is that we had overflights, that we had, our planes would overfly 30% of northern Iraq, 30% of southern Iraq, which used all the oil fields. Saddam Hussein couldn't move. I mean, he didn't control 60% of his country, so he couldn't even control his oil. I mean, he couldn't sell his own oil. And you remember, oil had to be sold through the United Nations in order to take reparations out of oil revenues to pay Kuwait. So he was a dying man. We wouldn't have had to invade him. Kurdistan, in those 10 years we had overflights, got percentage of the oil. And what they did up there was a golden age of Kurdistan. It was amazing what they did up there. Now, we're strong supporters of Kurdistan and the Kurds, and we'll continue to support them. People talk about the PKK and different KPP and so on. There are different groups in Kurdistan, and what the Turks have said, that they're terrorists. We hate them. They keep coming across the border. We'll do everything we can to eliminate them. Well, we've taken a different position, but the Turks are right with some of this. They are right with some of it. So we've had to kind of walk this carefully. And the KPP is in, as you all know, in eastern Syria, and they continue to be a problem for the Turks. I don't think the Turks have handled it particularly well in over the years. So that's just another one of those problems that I don't see any conflict resolution coming in the near future, because the problem is there are so many higher priority conflicts and problems in the world than that one. And it's a problem, yes. It's a serious problem, yes. But we're going to continue to support the Kurds.
Thank you. Secretary Hagel, another question here. You were almost old enough to be president, if judging by so you're getting ready. You've got a lot of the prep work already done.
Yeah.
Here's a good question. If you were president of the United States, you've served in Congress, you've been a Secretary of Defense, you understand the way the world works. If you were president of the United States and you were given broad congressional support, what are the three most important things that you would do to repair the damage that globalization has done to so many American workers, so many towns, and so many cities?
Well, if you take that perspective only, the damage that's been done by globalization, and you don't offset that with how much globalization has meant to the economy of this country and opportunities for this country. And some of them, those companies are represented on this Zoom call, Hallmark and so on. Then you're missing the whole story. The history of man has been about offsets, about times get worse for a certain group of merchants, people, approaches, things get better for this approach, and then it swings back and forth. I mean, you go back to the agrarian days. I mean, you can go back to any time there was an invention of anything. Oh my God, it's going to put people out of work. I mean, I suppose when people invented the stone wheel to be able to move rocks and wheat and whatever on a cart with stone wheels, that put people out of work because people didn't have to bend over and carry it on their backs anymore. So that's been the history of mankind. Now, that said, then how do you adjust this? Those who are displaced by globalization, the technology has passed them by or whatever it is, you're not going to turn the clock back. You're not going to go backward. You've got to go forward. So you've got to find new approaches, new avenues, new opportunities, new things, new training, new education, new hope, new possibilities. That's where government can play an important role. And also working with the private sector. But that's not going to ever change. I mean, it's going to continue. And yes, some people have been hurt by globalization and displaced, but you're not going to stop the progress. It isn't going to stop. So you got to face the facts and the reality. So I hadn't thought about this if I was president or something, but one of the things that I would do, I'd put a commission together to take a look at this. And I would ask that commission to go deep into it and come out with recommendations. What should we be doing? What can the government do to offset this? Help, working with the private sector. This isn't the government alone. You're not going to do it without the private sector. And because you're going to need new training for people. You're going to need a lot of things. Find new opportunities. This is why trade is so important, because the offsets where people get hurt or lose jobs should be offset by the new opportunities we have to export and new markets to find things, so that there would be new jobs created. That's the first thing that I would do as well. Another thing I would do as president, I would start as a president I would start having, Bill Clinton used to do this all the time. And I was a young Republican senator, so I don't know why he invited me, but I got invited to a lot of these. He'd have private dinners up in the president's private quarters, and he'd bring in 2 or 3 Republican senators, 2 or 3 Democrat senators. He'd always have a couple of cabinet members, not too big, and him. We just go around the table and talk and have a couple of drinks, and I'd tell Lilibet, my wife, when I go into the Senate that morning, I said, "This is gonna be a late night. We're gonna have dinner with Clinton." I mean, he'd go all night long. I mean, he'd listen. He was the best listener I ever met in politics. And then he'd just summarize it at the end. I would start something like that if I was president. Bring these people back together. There's nothing now there's no opportunity to socialize. When I first got to the Senate, you saw that all the time. Democrats, Republicans fight like hell. No, I believe this. No, I believe this. But we liked each other, actually. We got along with each other. We didn't see each other as the enemy. I never introduced a bill, I don't think, without a Democratic co-sponsor. It was just a smart thing to do, because I knew I was going to need some Democrats, because all the Republicans wouldn't be with me. I knew. So it was just smart. Just do it wisely. So I would do something like that, where I think a president can make a difference. And Biden would be perfect for this, because he was in the Senate 36 years. He was that kind of a senator. Everybody liked him. I mean, Republicans liked him. Everybody liked him. He did it as vice president. I mean, he'd be the perfect president to do it. I might suggest that to him. As to the third thing I would do, I would also seek some advice from people outside of government, people you trust in different industries. And I wouldn't formalize it with a commission as to what they think. And I'd have them in for lunch or maybe a dinner, what they think are the priorities of the country. What should the priorities be? And I'm not talking about, COVID obviously is a priority. The economy, getting the economy, we know that. But today's gone. Today's gone. Very little you can do about tomorrow. But what you can do is you can reach out in the future and anticipate things. And you can't stumble over today and the problems of today. You got to pay attention. But that's gone. What are we anticipating going to happen in the future? I don't think we pay enough attention to that at all. The Pentagon does a good job of that, because they have to commit to platforms of ships and planes, equipment that are out into the future, 10 years, 20 years, and so on. But I don't think our political people do a good job if they do it at all. So that's it. I'll take one more question, then I do have to get out of here.
Well, you have already. Are you sure you want to take one more? You've done your time.
Oh, no, I'll take one more, and I'll give you a short answer. So,
all right, there's one. Do you think the United States should create or join cyber control agreements with other countries, or will it too strongly inhibit the offensive use of these weapons by our military?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's one that I don't think we've thought about, quite frankly, very much. We've been very reluctant to use our offensive cyber capability as we could. I mean, our potential in cyber and what we currently possess, no country in the world has it. But because we're the kind of people we are, the kind of country we are, we're very careful and reluctant to use that capability, that offensive capability. But I think that we need to, it's another one of these issues. I think we need to take a real look at this, because cyber is I think, as I've already said, the number one threat to the security of this country in every way. In business, in banking, it doesn't make any difference. In our military, our intelligence agencies, in our governing. I mean, we've seen it in elections. We saw it in 2016 with the Russians. So we're going to have to put a lot more focus on it, I think. And I mean, I don't know, as far as joining a group, you'd want to know what the groups, would China join it? Would Iran join it? Would North Korea join it? Who would join it? what would be the parameters? What do you agree to do and what do you agree not to do? Every nation state has always the option of, if you were attacked, you have the option of and responsibility to respond to that attack, regardless of what treaty you sign or what agreement you have. If you're attacked, I mean, you're attacked, and you've got to defend your country. So I'm generally in favor of those kinds of agreements, those global agreements, because I do think that it brings people to the table. I think it gets people talking. I know people cheat. I know the Soviets cheated all the time. The Russians cheat. But I think it's better than not having it, because you'll learn a lot. It gives you influence into their places too. It gives you options. And I would much prefer to have those treaties and those agreements than not have them.
Okay. Well, Secretary Hagel, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt Hughes for a final farewell. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Doctor. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Ellen, thanks so much. And Secretary Hagel, we're very appreciative of your gift of time and insight today. Special thanks to our sponsors for today's program, Hush Blackwell, the Lawrence D. Starr Center for Peace and Justice at the University of St. Mary, Honeywell, Nicole Gresham Perry, and Hallmark Cards. Thank you all for your support. Secretary Hagel, we certainly hope that you'll join us the next time you're around the Kansas City area when it's prudent to do so. We look forward to welcoming you back.
Well, my pleasure, really, and thank you all, and thank you again for what you do for your community.
Thank you. That means a lot. And everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Do check us out online at irckc.org. And until we see you again, please stay safe. Take care.